Welcome to this book launch organized by the Reactionary Politics Research Network. It's a pleasure to have you here, and it's a pleasure to be chairing this book launch. So the book today that we are launching is The Far Right and the Media, International Trends and Perspective, which is edited by Imogen Richards. It's an absolutely brilliant book published by Routledge. It's out now. You can order it. There's a link on the RPRN webpage as well, and make sure that you order it at your libraries. So as I mentioned before in the waiting room, this is going to be recorded. So if you could please mute yourselves. So this is going to be recorded, and the Q&A will not be recorded though. So you are very welcome to turn on your cameras then and to ask any questions that you want. If you'd rather ask your questions in the chat, that's absolutely fine as well. So what we will be doing is have the three presentations now. Unfortunately, Greta Jasse cannot join us. She's unwell. But I'm sure there'll be other opportunities to invite her to the RPRN. So we will have three presentations. We will start with Imogen Richards, who will introduce the book for us. Imogen is a senior lecturer in criminology at Deakin University, and her research focuses on the political economy of political violence. We will then have Jeff Sparrow, who is a writer, editor, and broadcaster. His books include No Way But This, In Search of Paul Robeson, Fascists Among Us, Crime Against Nature, and many other. And he's also a senior lecturer at the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne. We will then have Ayşe Lokmanoglu, who is an assistant professor of emerging media studies in the College of Communication and affiliated faculty at Computing and Data Science at Boston University. So yeah, we have people from speakers from Australia, from Australia, from the US, and I am in the UK, so that explains also the timing for those of you for whom it's a bit late. Unfortunately, Greta will not be able to join us, and hopefully Carmen will be able to join us to talk with Ayşe, Carmen Celestini, who is a lecturer in religious studies at the University of Waterloo in Canada. So without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Imogen, who will introduce the book. Imogen, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Aurelian. Just bear with me, everyone. I'll just share some slides. Okay. So good morning and good evening and afternoon, I think, maybe for some people. So thanks for coming along. My name is Imogen Richards, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce our book, as Aurelian's just done. So this was published just this last month by Routledge, and it brings together really scholars from different perspectives around the world to try to address what some of us think are the most pressing questions which are confronting sort of democratic and nominally democratic societies today. And that's, how do media institutions participate in the mainstreaming of far-right politics? And then what sorts of things might we do about that? Okay, so a core problem that motivated this book was reflecting on the past decade and longer, really, but particularly then, in which context far-right actors have achieved a level of visibility and political legitimacy that might have been difficult to imagine, a generation ago. So the institutionalization of Trumpism in the US, the electoral rise of nativist parties across Europe, and also the growing prominence of politically violent actors that espouse sort of genocidal and eliminationist intent, are not isolated phenomena. They represent, I argue, a structural shift in the political landscape, particularly in the sort of so-called global north, or the wealthy world as well. So critically, this shift also isn't occurring in a vacuum, separate from media. So far-right movements have risen to prominence through media systems, not despite them. So this volume proposes a dialectical framework for understanding that relationship. So rather than treating the media as a passive conduit exploited by opportunistic political actors, we, in respective contributions, approach media institutions as active, if often ambivalent, participants in the shaping of that far-right visibility. And what this means in practice is rejecting simplistic accounts that would position the media either as straightforwardly hostile to the far right or as willingly complicit in its rise. So the reality, as our contributors demonstrate across various international case studies, is far more complex. So media institutions both shape and are shaped by the political formations with which they interact. And they may reproduce or contest far-right politics, but they're always implicated in the processes through which such politics become publicly intelligible. So to understand how we arrived at this juncture, the book traces, in the opening conceptual chapter, traces a history, very brief history of structural change in journalism and media industries since the late 20th century. So I argue that a pivotal moment in that, following sort of other sort of so-called post-truth scholars, a pivotal moment in that was the Reagan administration's 1987 repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in the US, which had required broadcasters to present contested political ideas with accuracy and in the service of the public interest. And so that repeal was part of a broader neoliberal political project that redefined media as a commodity, which was governed by market forces rather than democratic public service. So it enabled two parallel developments that were to prove critical. First, the emergence of overtly partisan outlets that could present ideological content without counter perspectives. And second, a kind of a compensatory turn in mainstream media toward performative sort of both sides journalism, which I argue, constitutes a sort of a practice of false equivalence, as we've seen in respect of various issues such as global heating, in which empirically unsubstantiated claims are presented as positions that are sort of worthy of equal consideration. So these shifts, combined with the broader neoliberal restructuring of public institutions, has in part created those structural vulnerabilities that far-right actors would then learn to exploit. And exploit them they have, as our chapters seek to show. So it's now well documented that far-right actors have adapted to contemporary media environments, particularly through tactics like strategic provocation, symbolic inversion, and the deliberate staging of controversy. So their messaging foregrounds themes of victimhood, free speech, and hostility to perceived elites, while invoking these sort of civilizational and racial hierarchies that actually protect privilege, but also project exclusivist and supremacist political ideologies as legitimate expressions of national loyalty. So there's a lot of concepts in that, but what's essential to understand there, and what the book tries to emphasize, is that the media's amplification of those narratives isn't always or even typically the result of ideological sympathy. So more commonly, it can reflect institutional logics and practices that prioritize engagement and profitability. And far-right content then is often sensational, conflict-driven, and visually spectacular sometimes, particularly in its sort of more morally deplorable elements. And that's precisely the qualities that contemporary news values do reward. So some of the specific contributions illustrate these practices in action. So Brown and Mondon open the volume by illustrating how euphemisation and a kind of a lexical softening play critical roles in rendering far-right politics palatable within mainstream media discourse. So they illustrate how terms like populist, controversial, or anti-establishment without qualification are routinely substituted for more analytically precise descriptors like authoritarian, racist, or fascist. And these aren't neutral choices. They are editorial decisions that progressively normalise what were once deplored political positions. So Minucci and Narciso then provide concrete evidence of these dynamics in their analysis of Spanish and Portuguese tabloid coverage of Vox and Chega. So their content analysis of approximately 3,000 articles reveals how publications routinely employed accommodating language while omitting reference to these parties' ideological foundations in both racial nationalism and authoritarianism. So this framing coincided with the erosion of what scholars have termed Iberian exceptionalism, which is the notion that Spain and Portugal were resistant to far-right electoral breakthroughs. So Sengel and McSweeney extend this analysis to look at the settler colonial context of Australia, demonstrating that patterns of linguistic accommodation for the far right can't be understood in isolation from ongoing historical structures of racialization. So drawing on concepts including Morton Robinson's white possessive and Ray's racialized organizations, they show how media organizations operate within what can be understood as racialized or racializing assemblages. And these are networks of practices and discourses that naturalize colonial hierarchies. So Sengel and McSweeney's analysis of the media coverage of Pauline Hanson from the One Nation parties, It's Okay to be White motion, is a powerful demonstration in this chapter, I think, of how cumulative editorial choices can produce a public sphere in which professional reporting standards and far-right objectives can cohere toward mainstreaming coverage. So in the following chapter, Amarasingam, Lockmanoglu and Celestini turn our attention to the United States context. So they offer a detailed computational analysis, which we'll hear more about in a moment, of how different media outlets framed the January 6th Capitol insurrection. So using structural topic modelling of over 25,000 articles, they reveal stark disparities in how outlets with different political orientations framed identical events. So their analysis shows how conspiracy-focused media emphasised themes of deep state persecution and patriotic resistance, sometimes echoing the rhetoric of the insurrectionists themselves. Mainstream outlets, while more fact-based, were shown to sometimes refrain from naming the ideological drivers of the violence, but the chapter illustrates as well what we could call epistemic fragmentation, or a condition in which the very foundations for shared public deliberation are undermined and destabilised. So Wilson's chapter then on the 2019 Christchurch mass shooting, in which 51 Muslim worshippers were murdered at prayer, provides perhaps the volume's starkest illustration of how digital media environments can be weaponized. So the attack functioned not only as an act of terrorism, but as a form of media performance, if you like, that was deliberately curated for transnational dissemination. And this happened through live streaming and gamification and manifesto production, so-called manifesto production as well. So Wilson shows how earlier media reporting often uncritically repeated the claims that were made in the Christchurch perpetrators' manifesto. And this was including assertions about recent radicalization and his own sort of the perpetrator's claims about his own radicalization that were actually contradicted by extensive digital evidence that demonstrated this wasn't just recent as well, and sort of undermined his claims about the core motivations for that, including sort of pseudo-environmental justifications. So extensive digital evidence, as Wilson's chapter shows, reveals long-standing white supremacist and transnational engagement. So in their pursuit of immediacy and narrative coherence, media outlets, in the case of the reportage on this event, defaulted to familiar tropes that amplified the perpetrator's self-presentation over rigorous investigation into his actual motivations and sort of trajectory. So Sparrow's chapter we'll hear more about after me as well, looks at international media coverage of the war in Gaza, and it extends our analysis beyond domestic context. So particularly, I think this chapter demonstrates how representational practices that might eschew structural analysis can reproduce far-right worldviews on a global stage. So the framing of Palestinian people through reductive and often racialized narratives in the context of the Gaza war really are characterized by narratives that downplay suffering and associate both Muslim and Middle Eastern identity with violence, contributing to the broader circulation of far-right Islamophobic or sort of sentiment or sort of persecution against Muslim people within Western societies. So Sparrow's analysis reveals the structural role that liberal media can play in legitimizing far-right positions, particularly through bias that can correlate with ethno-nationalism and the rejection of sort of social liberal norms. So the volume's final empirical chapter, I think, by Jassa, who I unfortunately hasn't been able to join us, but examines, sort of takes a shift again in focus, and her chapter examines the German media's coverage of misogynistic incel communities. So through topic modelling of 194 articles from major German outlets, Jasser identifies how media framing strategies present this form of sort of extremism or sort of violent misogyny as an isolated pathology rather than as a symptom of broader societal conditions, including widespread anti-feminist sentiment and systemic gender inequality. So by portraying incel violence as exceptional or deviant, these narratives enable audiences to distance themselves from the misogynistic attitudes that underpin the phenomenon, while leaving unexamined the structural conditions from which those attitudes emerge. So this chapter reminds us that the gendered dimensions of far-right politics are also inseparable from broader questions of media responsibility. So together, the chapters across the volume reveal three interconnected dynamics. First, far-right mainstreaming through the media operates not only through explicit messaging, but also through representational patterns that can serve to exclude, marginalize, or naturalize systems of inequality. And second, these patterns are symptomatic of a broader structural crisis within democratic media, undermining its sort of democratic function. And these crises are rooted in several factors, including neoliberal transformations in public institutions and public value on shared knowledge as well. So third, addressing these demands addressing these situations does demand structural interventions rather than technical fixes, I think. But as well, there's also a note of possibility. So despite the critiques that we advance in this book, the media in many of the national contexts examined have also played really important roles in exposing far-right networks, revealing disinformation, and also amplifying the voices of those targeted by reactionary politics. So investigative journalism and public interest reporting are really remain to be essential resources in doing this. So it's our hope then, my hope particularly, I can't speak for all of the authors, but my hope that the volume can contribute to the recognition and support of media practices that would foster sort of deeper public connections through a sharing of information, and also advance through representation a more inclusive and accountable media agenda that ultimately sort of supports efforts to challenge the supremacist and authoritarian far right, both in the context that we look at, but internationally, given the influence of those countries in particular. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Imogen. Next, so we'll have the Q&A at the end. If you want to ask any questions, of course, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, you'll be more than welcome to kind of jump in after all the talks have taken place. The next speaker is Jeff Sparrow. Jeff, floor is yours if you want to share your slides.
Thanks. Aurelian. And thanks, Imogen, both for that presentation, but also for all her hard work in putting this project together. I mean, I'm sure lots of people listening understand that corralling academics into a project like this is kind of um, akin to herding cats, and she did so in a very effective way. So my chapter, can you see that? My chapter is looking at the rise of the far right and
You're no longer in
the
full screen, Jeff, just to let you know. Yeah.
fuck this. Uh, oh, I don't think I'll use that. Looks at the rise of the far right and the coverage of the Israel's war in Gaza. And I have to say, it's in some ways it's quite a tentative argument that I'm making. I'm focusing on the correlation between the two. I'm not making any particular claims about causation, and that's partly because, you know, as I'm sure people know, arguments about causation in media studies are very difficult to make. But it's also because it's an area that's massively under researched. I just wanted to stress that, I think, because it might be something we want to talk about as we go on in this session, the particular kind of context in which we are researching here. Journalism studies is a kind of innately, historically kind of liberal field, but that liberalism has in the past not necessarily had very much at stake. You know, like it was fairly easy for people to write, I don't know, articles attacking Trumpism or talking about the need for better reporting without feeling any consequences as a result of it. And I feel like now we're moving into a situation where that's not necessarily the case. I know, you know, I was trying to get together a project using some algorithmic measures to study the coverage of the Gaza conflict, and you know, all of the computer types that I was talking with would go so far with the project and then would simply say, look, I don't want to proceed with this because it will be bad for my career. And I suspect increasingly that will be the case for people researching the far right more generally. You know, in the past, it was an area where one could make quite radical statements without necessarily feeling there was very much risk in doing so, but we are no longer necessarily in that movement. And in fact, I think this kind of field is going to become a lot more difficult in many ways. So that might be something that we might want to talk about as we go on. Okay, so basically, I wanted to start by simply making the argument that overwhelmingly the media coverage of the war in Gaza was tremendously supportive of the Israeli narrative and hostile to the Palestinian narrative. And I won't go through that argument in detail. I used to be a bookseller, and I feel like at these sort of events you always say, buy the damn book if you want to read it. But the literature that's available, and honestly, there is not as much academic scholarship of this as there should be, for precisely the reasons I'm talking about before, but overwhelmingly show that in terms of international mainstream media coverage, what we see is a privileging of Israeli claims, a corresponding denigration of Palestinian sources, an absence of context, dehumanization, and so on and so forth. And I look at that in relation to Piro's understanding of the far right as divided internally between the radical right and the extreme right. So the argument is that, you know, both wings of the far right oppose liberalism, endorse ethno-nationalism, but the radical right accepts the idea of democracy even as they oppose liberal ideals. The extreme right are hostile to democracy and seek to remake the societies in which they operate through a process of violence. Both are committed to forms of ethno-nationalism, but you know, crudely, the extreme right are fascists, and you know, the radical right are often described as populists. And I draw on an interesting study by Wanderers and Zanello comparing attitudes to Israel of the European parties of the radical right and the extreme right. And basically, they survey the parties of the radical right and they note that both the radical right and the extreme right in Europe have an historical association with anti-Semitism. Today, however, the radical right parties are what they describe as Israel-friendly, whereas the parties of the extreme right are not. So how do we explain this? Well, the parties of the extreme right remain basically committed to the rhetoric of classical European fascism. The parties of the radical right, on the other hand, have spent decades engaged in a process of reshaping 20th century racial rhetoric. And a key element of that has been, since the onset of the war on terror, an embrace of Islamophobia, which is now a key component of the radical right's rhetoric. And I think most people would be familiar with that process. Here, I'm in Australia, and the context, I think about someone like Pauline Hanson, the most prominent representative of the radical right, who in her original incarnation was more or less an old school Australian racist. Most of her rhetoric was directed against Indigenous people and what she called Asian immigration. In her initial incarnation, she did not mention Muslims at all. Today, of course, her rhetoric is almost entirely based on Islamophobia and anti-Islam rhetoric. And, of course, this Islamophobic turn on the radical right doesn't necessarily entail a rejection of anti-Semitism. On the contrary, it often bolsters it, since the tropes of Islamophobia are very close to the tropes of classical anti-Semitism. The radical right ideologues say that Muslims are criminals and political extremists. They dress strangely. They have odd dietary habits. They engage in peculiar religious customs. All of these tropes are associated with traditional anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, Islamophobia has allowed many of the parties of the radical right to build bridges with Israel. You might have been aware of the recent Israeli conference on anti-Semitism. Australians here might know that as the conference recently addressed by former PM Scott Morrison. The list of invited guests included a who's who of the radical right in Europe, many of which have historical associations with anti-Semitism, but their current focus on Islamophobia allows this closeness to the Israeli regime. So this is one of the correlations to which I wanted to draw attention, because almost by definition, because the mainstream media's coverage of Gaza has been so pro-Israel, it's been massively Islamophobic. And again, I don't want to go into this in detail, but you might be aware that here in Australia, we currently, during a visit by the Israeli President Isaac Herzog, and there's been quite intense demonstrations, particularly in Sydney on the weekend. But you can get a kind of sense of the way Islamophobia has been mainstreamed in the liberal press. A paper like the Melbourne Age has discussed the connotations of Herzog's visit almost entirely in terms of how it affects the Jewish community, with no reference whatsoever to what this might mean to Palestinians to see the symbolic representative of a genocidal regime in the country. So this normalisation of Islamophobia is obviously of significance when we're talking about the radical right. What does it mean for the extreme right? As I said, the extreme right has, by and large, maintained the traditional anti-Semitism of the 20th century fascist right. So here in Australia, the main manifestation of the extreme right is a group called the National Socialist Movement. I mean, no prizes in guessing their politics, but they are holding explicitly anti-Semitic demonstrations, against what they call the Jewish lobby. So you would think that the media's coverage of Gaza would be bad for the extreme right and would contribute to their further marginalisation. But in the chapter, what I want to draw attention to is what the far right and the extreme right share. So if you remember, in our demarcation, we talk about both the extreme right and both the radical right and the extreme right being hostile to liberal norms. And I think that's tremendously important, because if you think about what's happened during the war on Gaza, what we have seen is the complete erosion of the liberal laws and norms set up after the Second World War, with the impunity mostly enjoyed by the Israelis, fatally undermining things like the Geneva Convention, the International Court, the United Nations, and the media's complicity with that have been really important. I mean, journalists are supposedly a protected category in wartime. I think the most recent count I saw is that 234 journalists have been killed in Gaza. And with a few honourable exceptions, much of the media has said almost nothing about this wholesale killing of journalists. Likewise with the destruction of hospitals, the targeting of children, destruction of universities, the use of torture. And so the media indifference to this destruction of liberal norms correlates with both the attitudes of the radical right and the extreme right. So that's part of it. But the radical right and the extreme right are both committed to ethno-nationalism, and that's fundamental to both movements. And in that context, it's really important to recognise that most of the major human rights groups in the world describe Israel as practicing apartheid, the most extreme form of ethno-nationalism. Statements to that effect from Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem. And so in that context, the media's overwhelming support for Israel necessarily has the effect of normalising these kind of ethno-national discourses. When you have all of the mainstream media outlets providing favourable coverage to a ethno-nationalist state, well, again, you can see the correlation with both wings of the far right. But there's one final aspect of Gaza and the media's coverage that's particularly important, not just to the radical right, but even more so to the extreme right. And maybe I will just share this particular slide. Okay, can you see that? It's not very...
It's
okay,
still small.
Too small?
But I think that's fine now, yeah, if you make it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, this is drone footage. This is drone footage from the from Gaza, and you can see the absolutely extraordinary scale of the devastation that has been unleashed on Gaza. And as I'm sure many people here are familiar with, again, most of the most important human rights organisations in the world, and a whole array of scholars, have declared what has happened in Gaza to be a case of genocide. And if you look at the studies of the media coverage of Gaza, again and again, you will find the major media organisations utterly resistant to this kind of characterization, or even discussing the allegations that are being made. I did a little study again of the Melbourne Age, comparing the way they responded to the killings of Rohingya people in Myanmar in 2017, where the Age was completely willing to declare that genocide, despite there being no ruling by the International Court of Justice to that effect. And you know, the Age went so far in response to the Rohingya to declare the need for sanctions on Myanmar, to breaking of all Australian ties, and so on and so forth. They have actively refused to do anything similar in response to Gaza. And the reason why this is so significant when we're talking about the extreme right is, of course, the extreme right is differentiated from the radical right because of its commitment to redemptive violence as a way of destroying the liberal regime that it so despises. And since the 20th century, the commitment of the extreme right to this kind of violence has been crucial to its marginalisation. And so I think it's incredibly important to think about what the consequences might be of the majority of the mainstream media downplaying credible allocations of genocide in response to Gaza, and what that might mean for a political project that is based on normalising extreme violence and indeed normalising the idea of genocide. And that, I think, is the aspect of this that concerns me the most. It seems to me that, you know, that what we've seen in Gaza is one of the great moral atrocities of our time, and we are only just beginning to understand what the consequences of that will be. But it seems to me that one of the consequences that we're going to have to deal with is it normalizes and acclimatizes the population to a level of devastation, a level of violence that once would have been completely unthinkable. And it is tremendously frightening to think of where that might lead. And I will stop on that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff, for your presentation. Our last presentation is by Aisha. If you want to share your screen, remember, if you want to already ask your questions, feel free to use the Q&A. Aisha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sorry, one second. Let me. Right. It's working, right?
Yeah, it's working.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. Today, I'm representing how media bias and political silos help American media cover January 6th, and I think it's kind of apt coming after Jeff, so we're going to be looking more at media. I will say I'm the more methodologic person of this group, so unfortunately, Amar and Carmen got stuck on a train, but so if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to carry. If I can't answer some of the theoretical points, I apologize in advance. So, no, perfect. So what we were really interested in was actually looking at US media outlets and how, and on different ideological spectrums, which I'm going to come to it in a second, and how January 6th became almost like a moment of a stress test in American media. And first of all, January 6th didn't, appear out of nowhere. It was actually followed previously months of actually stolen election rhetoric and escalating distrust to institutions at large. So in this chapter, we really were interested in asking how did different parts of the news media frame and prioritize the narrative surrounding January 6th before and after it happened. So did anything change basically? Or was it like a tipping point? So we really kind of wanted to see. And we focus on media bias not as a label bait, but more of a measurable future of the news ecosystem in general and how audiences see it and how they actually interact with interpret events and how political conflict gets actually how does it reinforce political conflict. And I'm going to come to the specific outlets we chose in 1 second. But so we were really, like I said, we were really interested in this convergence. So there was like a build up before, and it was filled with fears of conspiracy and distrust, which is still continuing. And then there was, and then media kind of, what did the media create basically, and how did it react to it? So what we did was we actually collected 25,000 articles from, I'm going to show you again, sorry for like doing this, I'm going to show you from 8 different news outlets between November 1st and March 1st, so November 1st, 2020 and March 1st, 2021, so that we would have a period of before and after the event actually, that we can actually look at it. And then what we did was something called structural topic modeling, which I'm not going to get into it, but if you're interested, I'm more than happy to talk more about it. But what structural topic modeling does is it actually looks at the content while keeping some of the variables, which is our media bias, actually within the model itself, so that you actually have you can actually statistically test the differences between topics. We use something called media bias fact checked. I'm not sure if you're all familiar, but media bias fact checked is a completely nonprofit organization in US, and it's actually used by not only academics but also by NPR, by New York Times to fact check, to actually so it's a very known organization, even though the website has a lot of ads and everything. So it doesn't look, when you go into it, it kind of makes you question, but actually it's a pretty, I was going to say it's a very legitimate website, and it's been used by academics quite a lot and cited quite a lot. So what we did was we actually went through the list all together, and we picked 2 for each of the categories, and these categories are what media bias fact check defines. So these are not our categories, these are media biases. And you can see, I took a screenshot, but they have, they have the second tab after home is actually bias categories, which you can find many different things. They have pseudoscience, they have questionable sources, they have conspiracy. So, and which we had. So what we picked was first right bias, one left bias, one conspiracy pseudoscience, and one what they call least bias. So for right bias, we picked Washington Examiner and Daily Caller. For left bias, we picked Daily Beast and Jacobin. For conspiracy, we picked InfoWars and X22 Report. And for least bias, we picked Reuters and AFP. So we tried to give, and we did some iterations of it. We tried to give balanced number of articles, and that's why we actually went with these sources as well. So we tried to see sources that covered first of all, covered the period really well, covered the election period really well, sources that we can collect the full articles from. So there was a bit of a convenience choosing, but also we were, there was a few back and forth going between which outlets that we were going to actually choose, media outlets we were going to choose. So this is a very complicated statistical thing, but I wanted to show you that. So these are the topics that all of them talk together basically. And in each of them, you can see the combined score for each of our media bias. And I think just looking at, and the blue dots are significant and the gray dots are insignificant. So I think one thing that's very, I think just should jump on you is the amount of blue dots. So before and after, there was significant changes on the volume on the topic, basically we call topic coherence, on the topic distribution on all of our media categories. So it wasn't just something that happened in conspiracy, it was actually on least bias. And you can see actually in least bias, there's only two insignificant categories, which was Fox News rating success and 2020 NFL season highlights. So, and the rest of all of the categories actually positively increased post January 6th. Conspiracy pseudoscience has more of a mix. Some categories were less, some categories were more. Left bias also is a mix, and right bias is also a mix. And we actually had some mirroring topic coherence between left bias, right bias, and conspiracy pseudoscience, which I think is interesting in general to think about it. So and we use least bias was our reference category. So that's just one thing. So some of the findings that I really wanted to talk about was first was like in the conspiracy focused outlets, we really saw emphasizing controversy, grievance, and distrust. So and those were the topics that really kind of got more and implemented more. And there was more positive attention to narratives like election integrity protests, platform censorship controversy, audit-related claims, specifically election audit-related claims, while there was a de-emphasizing of topics that were more about institutional legitimacy or mainstream public health narratives, things like pandemic response, vaccine distribution, we saw less actually. The mechanic of things such as like I said, institutional things such as like mechanics of presidential transition. Again, we saw being de-emphasized. So the overall pattern of the media logic for conspiracy pseudoscience is what we called self-reinforcing loop, which was emphasizing suspicion and victimhood, basically. So that was how we described the topics in conspiracy and pseudoscience outlets. Second, the least biased outlets, Reuters and AFP, if you remember. So they actually showed major attention towards major public interest topics. So things like actually like election results, transition, so Capitol security, other national events like arrests, basically. So they were more of what we call the news actually. So what they did was, which I thought was interesting, they didn't have the same topic avoidance or topic emphasizing. So they were actually depolarizing in their content. And we saw actually no significant negative effects actually, which corroborates our results. So left bias, like I said, left bias and right bias, I thought were actually really interesting in a sense that, so left bias tended to foreground, emphasize things like accountability, institutional critique. However, they also emphasize scandals, arrests, like conspiracy controversies, specifically around, things that frame January 6th. And they actually really highlighted January 6th as a threat to democracy, basically, and highlighting the right-wing nature of January 6th. So that was actually the emphasis of left-wing outlets. While right-wing outlets actually did what they did was their attention was actually more towards the conservative identity and again the grievance factor, which I think, like I said, it plays into this, like following Jeff's topic, it really plays into this, where it was like election integrity process protests, how it was like how, you know, they were grieving, but also censorship, how they were the victims of you know, things were now are happening, and they really tended to downplay the negative topics, such as like the, you know, the valid institutional response, or like, you know, democratic governance policies, or like things like COVID policy, basically, or transitioning. So they really they really downplayed those as in like in the topic, and also some other like state capacity. They were emphasizing that what states can do, what federal government cannot do. So trying to kind of, in a way, start what we're seeing now in US politics, basically. So, I think, so our final conclusion was that across the board, January 6th wasn't just reported. And I think and we tried to show these variations and how they actually played differently into different audiences. And there is a lot of, and in media studies, we do see audience segmentation a lot. So even though everyone says, I watch everything, I do everything, we actually do get our information from our own, what aligns with our own interests, basically. And the way that the attention was organized was on these narrative packages. So grievances and, you know, victimhood versus like, you know, justifying and institutional, you know, integrity. So the media really actually reinforced the political silos. And we do see this, I think, in generally in the far right and media, but really it's a self-reinforcing, self-legitimizing, self-validating loop that we saw pre and post January 6th. So yeah, that's it from me. Sorry, I do present really fast, so but oh, I have one more slide, sorry. And then just wanted to say that again, like I really wanted to emphasize that the conspiracy-oriented media really amplified the narratives of like systematic corruption, grievance, victimhood, while really downplaying institutional legitimacy. So I think that really makes the important part here. While the least biased outlets, which, you know, I do think we like criticizing the media, but on our research, they actually really tried to do more fact-based reporting and really tried to actually emphasize, like they tried to de-emphasize ideological amplification, but rather just report. And left and right, like I said, exhibited mirrored polarization, so emphasizing their ideologically topic and political actors. Yeah. So yeah, so that's so I think we should ask for accountability in our polarized media environment. But yeah, thank you very much. And if you have any questions.